Detroit firefighters are bracing for Devil's Night. That's the annual pre-Halloween arson spree. Last year, 281 blazes were reported. City officials are taking steps to try and stop the fires.
The night before October 31st has its own long history with various names, depending on who you ask. In 18th century Europe, it was called Mischief Night. Teens in New Jersey, parts of Pennsylvania, in New York, Delaware, Connecticut, and New Orleans still call it Mischief Night. Some people in New Jersey and New York call it Goosey Night. No matter what it was called, it was often a night of debauchery, arson, and vandalism, seemingly inspired by early Irish-American traditions of Halloween night violence, arson, and vandalism. By the second half of the 20th century, neighborhoods and local organizations prepared for Mischief Night by offering activities that enticed children and teens with candy, costume contests, and dancing. Wise store owners would stop selling eggs to children and teens in the last days of October, while adults in the 50s complained that Mischief Night had once been about fun, but was now too rowdy and violent. Mischief Night is an American tradition. For 50 years, it has been associated with soaked windows, scattered corn, and ringing doorbells, declared a Delaware newspaper in 1961. It continued. In the last few years, harmless pranks have been overshadowed by outright vandalism by older groups who run the riot before the Halloween. 1965 newspaper in Chester, Pennsylvania asked 7 teens if Mischief Night should be discontinued, with 5 of them saying yes, citing destruction of property as the main reason. In segregated towns and cities, the bulk of the blame for Mischief Night shenanigans were usually placed on out-of-towners and minorities, reflecting both changing demographics and a rise in teen car culture. Teens in Michigan, especially the predominantly black Detroit, however, called it Devil's Night. Detroit had one of the biggest explosions of civil unrest in 1967, and it was due to a culmination of housing segregation, police brutality, and rising unemployment. With dozens of deaths and hundreds wounded among the raging fires, it served as a boogeyman for white people in the suburbs surrounding Detroit. Roughly 1,400 buildings were burned during the riot, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Detroit was on a massive decline in the 70s due to the oil crisis affecting its reliance on a single industry, automaking. 1975 article entitled "Goblin Proof Your House: How to Beat the Devil" in the Detroit Free Press discussed how older children in the previous year's Devil's Night had used pellet guns and bricks. And by the time the 1980s were ushering in a recession, when many other cities were reporting less rowdy Mischief Nights, Devil's Night in Detroit was known for arson. In 1984 alone, 810 fires were reported between October 30th and November 1st. This was due to an increased number of vacant structures, which included a higher proportion of single-family housing units compared with other major urban areas. Detroit is a sprawling city, and its roughly 139 square miles contributed to urban decay because there were thousands of empty buildings, and many of them were used to sell drugs. That brings up another interesting layer. Detroit residents were rumored to set fire to known trap houses, taking anti-drug enforcement into their own hands. But also, the increased media coverage in the years leading up to the hellish conditions of 1984 had brought in folks from out of town, many of them white, many of them possibly looking for a chance to blow off some steam in a neighborhood that wasn't theirs. The event suddenly became a spectacle, with fire buffs and enthusiasts trekking in from out of town, according to sensationalist news reports, to see Detroit burn. Said one fire photographer, "It's real unusual to go to these fires in the ghetto and see 200 white guys taking pictures." It wasn't just white guys. A Tokyo-based production crew even showed up to capture shootings, stabbings, kids selling drugs on the street, a lot of violence. Wrote one sarcastic columnist in 1985, "Don't you just love it? No longer is Detroit known as a one-industry town. No longer must we use the pulse of the automobile industry as a measure of our own well-being." In 1986, a student newspaper on the University of Michigan Dearborn campus offered 10 gallons of gasoline to anyone who guessed the correct amount of Devil's Night fires that year, a contest which got canceled by the chancellor. I'm sorry, I had to do it. Dearborn was a majority white suburb with only 85 of its 110,000 residents black. It had even designed a defeated ordinance that would restrict its parks to residents only, to keep Detroit riffraff out. Some argued that the media coverage of fires and violence was sensationalist and overblown, in the same vein as the crack phenomenon and super predators of the late 80s and early 90s. A 1990 Newsweek article criticized an ABC segment on Devil's Night, saying it lapsed into gratuitous stigmatizing shorthand and downplayed the important work of local black activists and community leaders who were combating violence and arson. And activists and leaders were organizing. In 1985, Mayor Coleman Young established the Devil's Night Task Force, which became the Anti-Arson Initiative Steering Committee. Children under the age of 17 were not allowed out alone in the streets between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m.
This unidentified youngster told his dad it was the police officer's fault he stayed out.
They stopped us at 5 minutes to 6 and talked to us until a minute after 6. Then they said, well, it's time now.
You don't buy that, Dad?
No, he wasn't supposed to be out of the house. He knows it.
And this was the scene at the police command center tonight. 24 police and civilian personnel monitored a task force spread out around the city.
By 1990, the number of fires had reduced greatly to 281.
The destruction caused by a few on Devil's Night, the rhythm and heartbeat of a great city gets slowed down.
You have to have a place to live. It's pitiful. We got to start doing something about it now.
On October 30th, get mad. Help us stop Devil's Night arson. For one day, Wednesday, October 30th, for 6 hours, you can help stop Devil's Night fires in your neighborhood. To volunteer, call 224-3450. Get mad. Get involved. Stop Devil's Night arson.
The fires were still a problem in the years that followed, peaking in 1994, the same year that a 1-year-old girl named Destiny Wilson was killed in a 4-story apartment building set ablaze. In response, community members rechristened the period before Halloween as Angels Night and went out on patrols. Approximately 50,000 volunteers marched the streets during this program's peak. But you know what really caused a significant drop in Devil's Night's arsons? The city razed thousands of derelict buildings in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. Less empty buildings meant less shit to burn. While the city still suffers from urban decay, more community investment and bouts of resurgence in real estate, along with an unfortunate amount of gentrification and private policing, have made violent Devil's Night a thing of the past. By 2017, Detroit would retire its Angels Nights patrols, with Fire Chief Eric Jones saying, "From now on, Halloween in Detroit isn't going to be about fear. It's going to be about fun."